Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT patch rundown video. Today's video will have our analysts doing a dive into all the patch changes coming in 10.7. It's going to be a really crazy patch as they are including the Galaxies mechanic. Alongside that, there's a whole list of balance changes as well. So let's jump right into it. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. All right, let's get back to the video, and to begin with, let's go over the system changes coming in 10.7. Before we go over the balance changes, let's talk about the addition of the different galaxies in 10.7. The three galaxies are Nicoverse, Lilac Nebula, and Medium Legends. Nicoverse, as the name suggests, will start everyone in the game with 2 Nico's helps. Lilac Nebula makes the beginning carousel all 4 cost champions, and the Medium Legends galaxy increases the health of every player to 125 and makes their little legends just a little bit bigger. These galaxies will add an interesting strategic layer to the game. Keep in mind that there's only a chance of one of these galaxies to happen each game, so you're likely to still see a lot of normal games. Back to the system changes, they're reducing the chance of 5 costs at level 8 in the shop. This change decreases the chance from 7% to 6%, as it was quite apparent in 10.6 that legendary champions were showing up just a bit too often at level 8. It's a great change to help shift the meta from 5 cost champions being so dominant. Time to move on to the balance changes for this patch, beginning with traits. Up first, we have a minor buff to 6 Blade Masters, as the chance to activate the additional attacks is going from 55% to 60%. A 5% increase is not so much, so don't expect this to suddenly make 6 Blade Masters worth going for, as it's not likely to change that much. It's good that they are buffing them, as it's rarely worth playing 6 Blade Master, but this small increase may not be enough. Brawlers are getting a nerf to 4 Brawler in 10.7, as the health is going from a bonus of 750 down to 700. This nerf is not that significant, but there's a lot of different champions and traits you can play in set 3 for frontline. This change to 4 Brawler just evens the playing field out a bit. Coming up next is a buff to 6 Chrono, as the attack speed is being increased from 65% to 75%. It's a fairly significant buff, as 10% is nothing to scoff at, but it is to the 6th piece of the trait, which is rare to see. In general, Chrono is played more like a splash trait than something you fully commit to in your build. There's a potential that this buff brings about builds that utilize 6 Chrono, but it's still likely to be rarely played. There's a potential that this buff brings about a build that utilizes 6 Chrono, but we think it's pretty unlikely. The next 2 changes are reworks to traits themselves. Darkstar will now be a buff of AD and AP to all other Darkstar champions when a Darkstar champion dies. Previously, the buff only jumped from one champion to another, which made it more unpredictable and harder to control, as there's usually only 1 or 2 champions you actually want the buff to go on. With this change, it's more unified, since all the Darkstar champions will get the effect. This will make Darkstar easier to play and overall a good rework for the trait. The second trait getting a rework is Mana Reaver. Essentially, there is no longer a 4-piece bonus, and the 2 trait bonus will now be replaced with what the 4-piece bonus was. The effect is that Mana Reaver's attacks will increase the cost of their target's next spell by 40%. It's a much needed change for Mana Reaver, as there was almost never a situation where you wanted to run the 4-piece of the trait in 10.6. Now it'll be much easier to splash in the trait, especially with a champion like Aurelia, who's played a fair amount. Going back to the regular balance changes, Mystic is getting a nerf to the magic resist 4 Mystics provides, as it's going from 120 down to 105, and to compensate that nerf, 2 Mystic is going from 30 to 35. In 10.6, you basically had to go 4 Mystic to really get much benefit out of it, and while an increase of 5 magic resist doesn't sound like a lot, it can definitely still have an impact. Overall, it's a great way to shift the power of the trait without having to resort to harsh nerfs or extreme buffs. And the last trait getting balanced is Sniper, as they're being buffed from 12% bonus damage to 15%. While this may seem odd considering Jhin has made himself a home in the meta for 10.6, it's overall a necessary change for the trait, since it only has 3 champions and Jhin is really the only one viable as a carry. Well, that's all the trait changes for 10.7. Let's move on now to the balancing coming to champions. To kick it off, we have several changes coming to 1-cost champions. Caitlyn is the first up, and with a reduction to her spell cast time going from 1.5 seconds down to 1.1 seconds. On top of that, she will also resume attacking more quickly after firing the bullet from her ultimate. These 2 changes will make her way less animation locked and increase her damage output overall. Xayah is up next with a small increase to her attack speed, as it's going from 0.75 up to 0.8. It's not a huge amount, but it's always important to keep in mind that attack speed scales way better when the base attack speed is high. The small buff will make it so giving her any attack speed bonuses will scale better and improve her ability to hold carry items early game. The first rebel to get nerfed is Ziggs, as his total mana is increasing from 40 up to 45. What this does is make it so he'll need an extra attack to get his ultimate off and lessens how strong Seraphs can be for him. He's still going to get his ultimate off quickly and frequently, but this change makes it happen just a bit less. It's definitely a healthy change. Lastly, for the one-cost champions, we have two buffs coming in for Zoe. The first buff is her starting and total mana is going from 90-120 to 70-100. Her other buff is a spell damage increase at level 3, going from 300 to 400 damage. In general, the only change to her that will matter much is the mana change, though in rare situations you could end up with a 3-star Zoe, so she'll hit a bit harder. Moving along to the two-cost champions, there's a health buff coming in for Darius. His health is going from 650 to 750, which is quite a significant amount and may make the Dunk Master be played even more often. Xin Zhao is getting two changes, with the first being an increase to his total mana from 50 to 60, and the second being a damage increase at all levels. His damage is going from 175, 250, 350 to 200, 275, 375. It's a bit odd that he's receiving a buff since he's quite popular in 10.6 with protectors. That said, the numbers aren't huge and he will cast less frequently with the mana increase, so it may help balance him. Onto the three-cost champion, starting with two changes to Ezreal. His damage is going from 250, 350, 700 to 200, 300, 600, and his mana is being changed from 60, 120 to 50, 125. Overall, it's a good thing they're nerfing his damage output and how quickly he can cast, since his ultimate has a strong effect on it. Alongside the changes to Mana Reaver, Cassidy is getting buffed in 10.7, with his total mana being reduced from 100 down to 80. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, since his ultimate also has the disarm effect. Cassidy definitely needed buffs, though they did buff him in multiple ways, which can always have unintended repercussions on the meta. Shaco is the last three-cost getting changes, as his ultimate spell bonus at level 3 is being reduced from 450% to 400%. Considering how strong Shaco 3 is, this is definitely a necessary nerf to make him a bit less oppressive to play against when he's at that 3-star level. All right, time to talk about 4 costs. Starting it off, we have 2 buffs to Soraka, as she is having her total mana reduced from 150 to 125, and her spell healing is going from 300, 450 to 350, 500. Not much needs to be said about these buffs other than they seem good for Soraka to make her more powerful and more in line with other 4-cost champions. Another champion that felt a bit lacking, Vel'Koz is having his total mana reduced from 80 to 70. This is a helpful change for sure, but it may not be enough for him, as he's been one of the weaker champions in 10.6. Perhaps being able to cast earlier and more often will be enough to make up for the weakness of his targeting. And for the last 4-cost champion, we have Wukong. Wukong's health is being buffed from 850 to 950, which is quite a lot. It's definitely a necessary change for him, as he hasn't felt quite up to the power level of the other 4-cost champions, even though he has a great ultimate. With his health buff, he should feel much better as a strong frontline champion. Now we move on to the real meat and potatoes of the patch, 5-cost champions. Let's start it off with Aurelion Sol. Aurelion is having his damage nerfed slightly, going from 120, 175 to 100, 150. The numbers aren't too drastic considering how strong he is, but it is enough to make him easier to play against, especially when he's level 1. The second change affects how his ability targets champions, as it will now be truly random as opposed to being weighted random. Weighting random means the targeting tended to favor enemies nearby, so with it being properly random now, it won't be as effective at dealing damage. Echo is next on the nerf block, though not by much, as his spell damage is being reduced from 250, 450 to 225, 400. His damage will still be great with items, but he's a bit less effective at level 2. The real culprit at 10.6 is Gangplank. Old Gangplank is getting a big nerf to his damage, as it's being reduced from 650, 850 to 450, 600. This may not be enough of a nerf to him, but for starters, it's definitely a good, healthy change to his power. The second nerf to Gangplank is a change to his mana, as it's being altered from 50, 150 to 75, 175. Basically, he's going to take longer to cast his second ult, which will be much, much later in the fight now. Overall, these are very necessary and good nerfs to Gangplank. Next up is a small nerf to the attack speed of Lulu, as it's going down from 0.85 to 0.8. This will impact how quickly she can get her ultimate by a very small margin and reduce the effectiveness of items like Shojin on her. And last, the star of the show go is Misfortune. She's getting a bunch of changes, starting with a decrease to her attack speed as it's going from 1.1 down to 1.0. Not much needs to be said about this other than 1.1 was a ridiculously high base attack speed, and lowering it is a good balance change. Her next change is to her mana as it's going from 5150 to 75-175. Just like Gangplank, this will make her second cast happen much later in the fight. Another good and necessary change. And for the last change, she's getting a spell damage nerf as it's going from 70-90% to 60-80%. This will make her do less insanely high AoE damage, which is definitely healthy for the game. All right, let's do a quickie on changes to items. Morellonomicon and Red Buff are getting burn damage decreased from 30% to 27%. Considering how much damage these items were putting out in 10.6, it's definitely a much needed nerf. Static Shiv is getting some love in this patch with an increase of 5 damage as it's going from 75 to 80 damage. It may push this item to the forefront of the meta, as you have to keep in mind that damage hits multiple champions. The last item change is a buff to Warmogs going from 4% health regen to 5%. It's a good change to an item that's been a bit lackluster compared to a lot of other defensive items in 10.6. All right, to end the video, let's go over the miscellaneous changes and bug fixes. The first change is to Echo, Aurelia, Lucian, Xin Zhao, and Echo's attacks performed as a part of their spell can now trigger effects like Static Shiv, Wingsu's Rageblade, and Runan's Hurricane. This will really open up a lot of itemization for those champions. One notable bug fix is that Rebel's shield no longer scales with AP. This has had a huge impact on games, considering Aurelion Sol would often be given AP items like Death Cap and receive the majority of the shields, meaning that he'd always have a large shield. The other bug fix affecting AP scaling is Hand of Justice healing no longer scales with AP. While this won't make Hand of Justice less appealing to make, it does make it a little bit weaker in certain circumstances. Another important fix that affects Aurelion Sol is that Aurelion Sol now works properly after Guardian Angel triggers. While it didn't necessarily matter much for itemization, it is nice knowing now that you can give him a GA without it messing up. That is going to be the end of our patch rundown video. Thank you for watching, and we hope you all enjoy the new patch, especially with the addition of the Galaxies mechanic. Be sure to let us know in the comments section below how your games are going and how the new patch is treating you with the different galaxies. We'll see you all in the next Giant Slayer TFT video, so make sure to like and subscribe and be notified when it comes out.